if you import 422 10-bit footage from Sony cameras into Resolve, nothing will change anywhere except in the color page. So if you go to the color page at the bottom of Resolve and you come here, you will see most of this looks probably very familiar to 18.4 or any previous version of Resolve you were using. The only thing that would be new for Sony users is that if you navigate into the bottom left here and go to the Camera Raw page, right here at the end, you will find that that Resolve recognizes the Sony footage as Sony RAW, which is a new format. Normally Sony RAW is called, like, it's from the Venice and it's like XCOCN or something like that. But now we have some of the lower end codecs coming from some of these prosumer cameras as Sony RAW, but it still has all the same functionality as the rest of the RAW formats, which is really, really cool. So the first thing I always do is I change decode quality from use project setting to full res Resolve, and still nothing becomes available, but that's okay. Or if you go to decode using and you go down to clip, all of this will unlock for you. You can adjust these in the project settings. You can go to project settings and go to camera raw. I have mine set to do this for me, but it never actually works. So I might be misunderstanding something, or it might be a bug. This was the case in the beta version, so I have a feeling I don't quite understand something. But either way, it doesn't really matter because I don't use the raw controls for every single clip. I use them only on clips that are needed. So if I just go down to any clip and just do this per process, it's a little slow and unoptimized, but in most of my workflows, it doesn't bother me. But if I were doing a large scale project, this would be quite frustrating. But you just come down here and change these two and make decode using the clip, and then you have all the access to all these things. Some of the cooler, more useful features that I've been using is white balance. You can change white balance to a value. If you feel like if I shot this a little too warm, maybe I wanted to cool it off a little bit, you can just drag it. You can also click in it or double click in it and then type in your value. You can also use customs, daylight, cloudy, shade, tungsten, which is really cool. If you botch it, if you botch your white balance on set, or if you just feel like it's a tad bit off, you can use this in place of using something like the temperature slider. You also get access to lift, gain, and contrast within here. I tend to stay away from this stuff. I always still use my standard color grading workflow within the node tree. So I don't usually use these, but white balance I use a lot, and exposure. This is actually really, really cool. I've been shooting with the FX6 for a little over a year now, and I almost never, ever use the EI function. I just put the camera at 800 and then either add more light or take light away when I need to. But with this, Resolve will actually recognize if you were monitoring at 400 EI or 200 EI or even 10,000 or 8,000 EI on the high base sensitivity. And when you load the clip up, it will be at that exposure value, which is pretty dang cool, because then it gives me an incentive to actually use the EI function, because it actually makes that calculation the way it needs to be done, instead of me like dragging down the offset wheel and I don't know if I'm actually at what I was monitoring. This way it is literally what I was monitoring. So if if you shoot using Cine EI and you go and you have it at 800 and you're like, this is way too bright, I'll just monitor what it would look like if I brought this down in post, this would actually be the value you were monitoring on your monitor on camera when you were shooting it. Which is a really cool function. And now I shoot using 400 or even 200 EI a lot to protect highlights or to increase shadow detail, which is quite nice. You also have access to sharpness, which I never touch. I just leave at 10. I don't do sharpness at all in any color grading or post workflow. You can adjust highlights, which again, I don't usually touch. I usually do all this stuff in a log working space before my color transform, and change all that. Sometimes maybe I'll do a little shadow or a little color boost here. But for the most part, the biggest things for me as a Sony shooter that this is nice for is color temperature, fixing that or changing it for creative purposes, and the exposure. The exposure is a huge one. That is really a needed feature, I feel, as a Sony user in DaVinci. But the rest is completely and totally the same. There's nothing different after this step. This is the only thing that kind of becomes new for Sony users. One thing to note about it is that it does not apply to a node. So I made let's just make crazy changes, and it doesn't matter because it doesn't apply to a node. So this happens almost like you were still shooting it. Like the clip is the same as if you had shot it. So it's, if I'm on set and I'm shooting this and I realize like, oh, I've overexposed this a little bit, or it's underexposed. Now I can do this and be like, okay, now this looks better to me. I'm going to go into my normal color grading workflow. And then I would go to my primaries and start doing, I would do a little bit of an S curve and get a contrast level, and then make new nodes and do everything that I would normally do. But it doesn't matter because this part happens before any of this, and it doesn't apply to a node. So it does make it difficult. Like if you put clips in a group, or you timeline change anything camera raw, it doesn't matter. So it's a very specific tool to use on a clip by clip basis, which in my experience I've found to be very useful and a perfect addition to my workflow because it's just what I needed. I don't need it to do too much. I just need it to be there when I need it. And yeah, that's all that as a Sony shooter you should know about the new Resolve 18.5 update.